For most of the past couple of centuries, philosophy and religion have been bedfellows, at least as far as college and university campuses are concerned. During my undergraduate experience studying in fairly small departments of state universities with just 5 or 6 faculty members, there was no small amount of enmity between the two disciplines that were forced to share fairly cramped office space with one another. But it was undeniable that they are historically bound to each other. Philosophers from ancient times right up to the industrial era wrote about religion. There were, of course, exceptions to that, but you couldn't really be a philosophy professor and not spend a great deal of time in study of great philosophical works that treated religious beliefs and claims. No one could dispute the fact that Søren Kierkegaard was a philosopher, but you have to admit that he was a philosopher who wrote almost exclusively about religion. One of the sayings I was introduced to when I was a teenager trying to find my way through those rather competitive department battles was this rather insulting description that said that philosophers are looking for a black cat in a dark room. Theologians are looking for a black cat in a dark room that isn't there. Or put it in an even more mean way, theologians make stuff up about stuff that is made up. At their root, philosophy is a search for truth, for wisdom, for understanding. Similarly, theology is a search for truth, wisdom, understanding about God. The two are very similar and really ought to work at least on the same ball field with the same set of rules of inquiry and reasoning and critical thinking. What we all know, however, is that religious folk too often abandon any rules of honest inquiry and just go off on flights of fantasy, and then they try to insist that everyone else pretend that their imagination is true. At some point, some ancient Persians come up with the idea of invisible eternal creatures who look like human beings, but they have wings. And you can see samples of that in the art in the British Museum from ancient Persia. Certain sects of Judaism, particularly influenced during their captivity in Babylon, become infected with the idea of these magical beings, with humans with wings that live forever. Christians took that imaginary creature in hand and they ran with it. Christians, not being willing to settle on just having one kind of magical eternal being that looks like a human with wings, they began to rank them. There are 3 different ranks of angels, cherubim, seraphim, and thrones at the top. There are 3 ranks with 3 kinds of, it's all got to numerically work out. So you have 9 kinds of angels, 3 at the top, 3 in the middle, and 3 in the bottom. Cherubim, seraphim, and thrones at the top. The second tier features dominions, virtues, and powers. And at the bottom, closest to human beings, were angels, archangels, and principalities. You would have had to have grown up Catholic to have heard of at least 3 or 4 of those different ones. And this is the sort of thing that makes philosophy professors refuse to have lunch with theology professors. In reality, of course, angels do not exist. But across the hall in theology class, they're given names, descriptions, and they even have a census count of how many of each kind that there are. In fact, in spite of the way that we tend to think of certain Muslim countries as being inhabited by religious fanatics, the United States of America has the largest percentage of its population who literally believe in angels. 80%. 80% of Americans believe in the literal reality of these purely symbolic religious creations, while fewer than 40% of Americans believe in evolution, and an even smaller percentage believe in global warming. Søren Kierkegaard said that there are 2 ways to be deceived. One is to continue to believe what is clearly not true, and the other is to refuse to believe what is clearly true. It is evident that the substantive difference between a progressive approach to faith and a traditional approach to faith is that progressives are interested in discovering what is true and not just defending what is traditional. We're not eager to resist or to condemn traditional matters of faith, but as Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And when there is no evidence at all, then the claim cannot be taken seriously. The point where my conversations break down with very many of my peers in ministry is that theology cannot be done by personal preference. Hence the line in the prayer of confession this morning that sometimes we're convinced that our opinion is important simply because it is our opinion, that we come up with a set of convictions that pleases us to think so, that people will just say, I believe that this is true, and because I like believing it is true. I may like to believe that I'm a giant taco that poops ice cream, but folks, there is no evidence to suggest that that is true. You may like believing in angels and demons, heaven and hell. You might like believing in a giant Santa Claus in the clouds who grants wishes, if only you wish hard enough. But if you want a reasonable person to believe in those things with you, you're going to have to come up with some good evidence or some reason to support those extraordinary claims. In the absence of evidence or reason for such extraordinary things, religious claims start to look a lot more like the rantings of a schizophrenic than the helpful teachings of a serious philosophy of religion. In fact, there was a study done recently to try to figure out why so many people, particularly the people who buy grocery store tabloids, insist upon acting like Deepak Chopra has something profound to say. At best, some of his alternative medicine suggestions could be called pseudo-science, but an awful lot of what he says actually doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, if you isolate sentences and try to say, what is he saying in this sentence, what you discover is that he isn't saying anything at all, but that he simply repeats certain important sounding terms. And he will cite terms that are used in physics, even though he does not appear to understand physics. But there's a certain gullible aspect to humanity that if you repeat these important sounding words and these scientific sounding terms, they begin to swoon. The guy's a quack. But as long as you don't take his health advice seriously, he's a fairly harmless quack. He has an interesting accent, he seems like a nice guy, and he wears funny glasses. So enjoy him, enjoy it, but don't take any of it seriously because there's not an ounce of sense in any of it. What is, I believe, rather more important than the religious mythology that causes so much dumbing down in our society is the more active and present magical thinking that is political discourse. That wasn't even Mel. Mel, is your hearing device working? Okay. All right. I get very frustrated with my religious peers who insist upon doing theology by personal preference rather than by evidence and reason. But religious people are amateurs at confusing opinions with facts compared to politicians. Immediately following the Paris Climate Conference, at which President Obama agreed to several very important goals in reducing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, a number of journalists interviewing members of his administration countered that a large percentage of Americans do not believe that fossil fuels are causing global warming, as if science was done by polling public opinion. As if somehow the president was wrong to try to save the environment for human habitation because there was not yet general agreement on polls taken in Oklahoma and Kansas and Arkansas. Now, people along the Missouri and the Merrimack Rivers in Missouri may not believe in flooding, but they may notice that water is up over their roof and their pickup truck is floating down the street. It doesn't really matter what you believe because you while you do have a right to have even misinformed opinions, you don't have a right to your own facts. Now, since the ISIS-inspired terrorist attack in Paris, the American presidential race took a decidedly different turn, with most voters in the United States are now willing to say that their primary concern going into this election year is terrorism. They say that because it's talked about constantly in the media. But factually, over the past 10 years, and it's 2016, so over the last 10 years, there have been fewer than 20 Americans killed by Islamic terrorists. Fewer than 20. During the same time period, over 600,000 Americans have been killed by gunshot wounds from our nearly plague levels of gun violence in America. Fewer than 20 killed by terrorists, primary concern. 600,000 killed by gun owners in America, we're not allowed to discuss it. Nearly 1 million have died from lack of access to proper health care. Nearly 1 million over the past 10 years. Because our for-profit insurance industry decides who gets treatment and who doesn't. The combination of political propaganda with the sensation-seeking corporate news has made our public more gullible and ill-informed than the most superstitious of religious people. Our 24-hour news cycle tends to point the camera at whatever seems interesting at the moment. But the media does not then become informative. You think about how much energy was wasted on trying to make Americans afraid of Ebola, when Ebola never represented a threat to Americans. You have Chris Christie putting that healthcare worker in a tent, isolating her from her family after she's done public service in Africa. I mean, the absurd measures that we went through out of just a public terror about Ebola, when we have actual threats that are killing tens of thousands of Americans that we're never even allowed to discuss. So when Ben Hecht, this 20th century screenwriter, said, trying to determine what's going on in the world by reading newspapers is like trying to tell time by watching the second hand, our 24-hour news cycle gives us image of stuff that's maybe happening right now. You think about like when the Pope was in the United States, how many times did you just see images of a plane sitting on the tarmac? The Pope will arrive here. The Pope will, we just fact, but without any context, it never tells you what's really going on in the broader perspective of the world. All this coverage of ISIS, there's about 30,000 ISIS fighters in Syria and Iraq right now. But you are 10,000 times more likely to be killed by your gun-owning neighbor than by anyone waving a black flag in Syria. And you may think that that's exaggeration, but the truth is the number is more like 30,000 times more likely to be killed by your neighbor than by a member of ISIS. But just think 10,000, that sounds big. It is alarming that more than 50% of Republican voters do want to ban all Muslims from immigrating to the United States. But when you couple that with the realization that 30% of Republican primary voters think that we should immediately bomb Agrabah, that fictional city that was home to Disney's Aladdin in a cartoon, then you realize that public opinion doesn't really matter for much. That just because you can get pollsters to get a response like that doesn't substantively mean anything about how you ought to run a country. Conservative religious people believe that imaginary religious beings are flying around on wings, and conservative political people believe that we should bomb an imaginary cartoon city, which could give us all something to snicker about, except for the fact that such sloppy thinking ends up with very real cities being bombed and tens of thousands of people dying from gunshot wounds in which the poor do not receive adequate medical care, and the violence of poverty keeps nearly half of our country's children in hunger and in danger. My new book should be published next month, and it's been a tedious process sorting through more than 500 of my published essays to select a representative choir of 150 that I rewrote for publication. The title of the book is Progressive Conversation, but like a lot of authors, a title is a title for selling a book, but the subtitle tells you what the author really thinks about the book. The subtitle is Essays on Matters of Social Justice for Critical Thinkers. And in some ways, I'd like for that to mean, if you're not a critical thinker, please don't read this book. Because I don't like hearing from people who just write back to me to say, I agreed with, or I didn't agree with this essay, or I like this essay, or I don't like this essay. What you agree or disagree with, what you like or don't like, doesn't mean a thing. You don't create a reality based on your preferences. If you don't like something, you've got to give a reason why. And even though I appreciate positive mail, don't just tell me you like something just because you and I agree. I try to offer well-reasoned perspectives in public. And if a well-reasoned person disagrees, you've got a conversation. But there's way too much division in America between the left and the right that has nothing to do with anything factual. It has everything to do with a them against us. I think that what I want to encourage in publishing this book is to try, especially in classrooms and in churches, to encourage critical thinking. And so simply disagreeing with me, you're welcome to do that. Lots of smart people disagree with me, but you need to have a reason. Trust me, the priest and the politician have spent centuries refining the science of how to trick you into believing things that make you a slave to their purposes, that will continue to trick you into voting against your own best interest and having religious beliefs that are in a world that's out there somewhere that probably doesn't exist, to keep you from engaging in the ethics of the world where you actually own a house and drive a car. Long before the short attention span created by the internet, social media, and TV news, George Orwell warned, political language, and with variations, this is true of all political parties, from conservatives to anarchists, is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable and give the appearance of solidity to pure wind. If Orwell could see the kind of public manipulation going on with our modern sophisticated media, I'm not sure that even he could believe it. One of my favorite internet memes of late says, a banker, a worker, and an immigrant sit down at a table where there's 20 cookies. The banker takes 19 cookies and says to the worker, look out, that immigrant is going to try to take your cookie. And that would be kind of funny if it weren't for the fact that this is exactly how our economy is working. What I hope that we are offering to our community and through our YouTube and iTunes channels to the nation and to the world is an engaged spirituality that does not make religion something of otherworldly or afterlife concerns, but rather seeks both to know the truth and to apply compassionate spiritual concerns to how we are living in the here and now. We can strive to raise the level of public conversation to help our nation to be oriented to honesty, to reality, and to address the real places where human beings are trapped in the violence of poverty, in ignorance, and by deception. We don't have all the answers, but I know this much. We're not afraid of any of the questions. We are willing to deal with any of the serious questions of life. So let us resolve in 2016 to do our part to continue to speak the truth to power.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.